Hi everybody, it's 7 p.m. Another scorcher of a day. And it's Friday, it's the weekend. Whatever weekends mean during a lockdown. But let me, Tom Bewick and Skills World Live, entertain you over the next 60 minutes with our radio diet of live chat, independent music tracks from Epidemic Sound, and debate with some of the finest people you will ever come across in the world of FE. Now, if you're fond of a libation or two, open that fridge door right now and pull out a nice cold drink. Got rather a nice glass of chilled Chablis here, actually, in front of me. Anyway, should we kick off with a song? This is called WHOLEHEARTED by Daxten. Back soon. Got a great programme ahead for you tonight, folks. Coming up after the news, I'll be talking to a range of FE sector leaders for tonight's big debate. And in the second half of the show, I'll be talking to a college principal about the Food Bank Friday initiative that is gone, well, viral, it seems, in terms of the support it's attracted. Finally, in the closing segments of tonight's show on Skills World Live, and especially for you, as it is a Friday night, I'll be employing my alter DJ ego, Van Allen, and providing you with a pre-weekend mashup of some of my favourite tech house tunes. Stay tuned for that. It's absolutely true, folks. Many, many moons ago, this Tom Bewick, then called Van Allen, could be found scratching those Technics turntables from cool pool parties in Miami to the super clubs of Ibiza, and quite a few unforgettable nights in between. Yeah, some I'd rather forget. But next, on Skills World Live, the stories making the headlines in the FE sector this evening. England's exam watchdog, Ofqual, has released its consultation on exceptional arrangements for awarding vocational and technical qualifications this summer. The move follows earlier arrangements put in place to calculate this summer's grades in GCSEs and A-levels. The regulator said that its aim was to deliver a process that was fair to students, but with the award of grades which would be as valuable as those given in any other year. Ofqual's chief regulator, Sally Collier, told this programme that it was vitally important that learners taking vocational or technical qualifications are not prevented from progressing in their studies or careers because of the unprecedented challenges this summer. In other news, the association that represents independent training providers has welcomed the government's latest guidance on financial support to the sector during COVID-19. Under Cabinet Office procurement guidelines, some training provision will be able to be claimed for ahead of delivery so long as ITPs deliver at least 40% in their qualification achievement rates and have good Ofsted reports. The boss of ALP, Mark Dorr, told FE News that while he thought the Education Skills Funding Agency had taken a step in the right direction, he said that government should provide funding across the board as all the activity was already provided for in departmental budgets without the need for bailouts, he said. In related developments, Eileen Milner, the chief executive of the ESFA, has written to the Federation of Awarding Bodies saying that where colleges and training providers are publicly funded for delivery of qualifications or endpoint assessment activity, they would be required as providers to pass these monies on to AOs and endpoint assessment organisations. And finally, a university vice-chancellor who earns more than £350,000 per year has decided to give 20% of his salary to the Student Hardship Fund. Professor Hugh Brady told this programme that both he and his executive team would be taking pay cuts of at least 10% as a contribution to the many challenges faced by COVID-19. That's all your Skills World news from fenews.co.uk. It's that time of the evening when we start our big debate, and tonight's theme is: should the skills sector get its own bailout? We did ask the Skills Minister, Gillian Keegan, to appear on the programme this evening, but despite some promising initial correspondence with the Department for Education's press office, our invitation, it seems, they never got back to us. Minister, if you're listening, you're welcome to come on this FE community radio station at any time. I'm sure you want to talk to the sector directly about the many different schemes that the government has in place to support everybody through this coronavirus challenge. Now, there are various Treasury schemes, amongst them the Job Retention Scheme, which is about giving employers up to 80% of the wage cost so long as they furlough their workers. And that's open to all sectors of the economy. Where it all perhaps gets a bit tricky is when we start to look at the additional support that could be available to particular sectors and businesses in the economy. Now, arguably, colleges have already had an additional support package announced in the form of their grant funding being guaranteed. But the ITPs are also up in arms, as we heard from the news earlier, that in fact even threatened some legal action earlier this week for not getting the same deal. So after this short musical break, I found just the man with years of experience working in the skills sector who hopefully can demystify some of what is going on. Last night on the show, I told you where we got our songs from, Epidemic Sound, and I said, look, as an audience, you're quite welcome to select the tunes. So Emma Evans from Ashby de la Zouche. I couldn't say that. Ashby de la Zouche. This is for you.
I thought I saw a light when you passed me by. The reason why I shine, you're the reason why. I thought I caught your eyes, but love is blind. I thought I saw you smile.
Reason Why I Shine by Thomas Skyldeberg. And as I said just before that track started, it's our first request on Skills World Live. We get all our music from an independent source, from epidemicsound.com. So if you don't like the tracks I'm playing, just head over to that website and drop me an email at skillsworld@fenews.co.uk, and I'll do my utter best to accommodate you. That track, of course, was selected by Emma Evans, and it's for herself and, of course, James and baby Robin up there in the East Midlands. So if you're listening, guys, that one was for you. Now, I said before that we've got just the man to kick off tonight's big debate on should the skills sector get its own bailout, and I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Stewart Segal, who's chair of the Youth Employment UK. We've got you on the line, Stewart.
Yes, indeed. Here, Tom. Good evening.
Yeah, good evening to you. Now, how's your COVID-19 lockdown experience going?
Well, like everybody, it's not easy. Got elderly parents and lots of worries, but I'm stuck in the middle of North Oxfordshire, so it could be a lot worse.
Could be, yeah.
But fingers crossed it's maybe not so long now.
You've been able to enjoy the fine weather, though?
Indeed, yes.
Yeah, good. I imagine the weather in Oxfordshire, if you've got a nice garden particularly, it must be delightful. Now, Stuart, every time I pick up a piece of ESFA guidance, I've got to be honest, I just get a massive headache. So can you try and demystify for listeners exactly what's sort of going on about the range of financial support that's available to the skills sector? Obviously, the government has had to announce, it's unprecedented, isn't it, in peacetime, absolutely massive financial support to all sectors of the economy. For example, the job retention scheme, which formally opened early this week. Millions and millions of private sector workers are having their wages subsidised because they've been put on furlough. Apparently the banks, and I say apparently the banks are supposed to be supporting the skills sector, although I did get an interesting email here, and I'll keep that person's name anonymous, and indeed the training provider that it related to. But apparently they'd been directed by the Skills Funding Agency to go to their bank for a cash loan under the government scheme. And whilst the bank was sort of sympathetic towards that, the bank was also saying to them that they shouldn't be paying any of their suppliers. And when this rather ethical provider went back and said, well, I think we should be paying our suppliers, this particular high street bank said, well, why, So I think there's clearly a bit of angst out there, to say the least, isn't there, about the fact that, this is a virus that is nobody's fault. You can't put any part of the sector, indeed any part of the economy, at fault for what's going on. But can you just sort of demystify for me then what support is available right now for the skills sector, and what's the sort of argument about in relation to what should or could be available if we get things right?
And I guess it's right to try and summarise it, though not easy. So obviously the government put in place some support for business, and I'm not going to judge whether that was good or bad support. I guess the question is, how does the skills sector get treated? And no doubt, every single training provider is considering whether they need to take advantage of that support, including loans, although everything that ALP has produced and everything I've heard, it's not easy to get a loan. And the furloughing of staff is something that, unfortunately, every training provider will have to consider. So whether you like all that, and then the debate comes, well, why should the skills sector be treated differently? And I tried to summarise it. I think the government had a choice. It either went down the furlough and loan route to say, look, we're going to sort of shut down this part of industry, and we're going to try and support you whilst you have to shut down. Yeah. Whereas the skills sector view was, we need it now more than ever, and therefore rather than going down that support route, why not come up with a scheme that has a straightforward preservation of the current funding levels, so that we can get on and do the job that we need to do with employers and with apprentices and preserve the system. Yeah. My own personal view, it will cost the government more money to go down the furlough route rather than use the money that's in existing budgets, and that's the other thing. So I don't like the word bailout. That sounds like new money required to preserve something without any activity. So what the skills sector was saying was, we are going to have the activity that we were going to have last month and the month before in any event, because we've got to support the current apprentices, and frankly, we're now going to chase around the country all those apprentices who are on furlough, who have been made redundant, who have their contracts terminated. So we've got the activity.
Yeah.
The only problem is the proxy that we currently use, in other words, how they estimate how we're going to get paid, is on activity and the wrong sort of activity. We've got different activity now, so the proxy doesn't work.
No,
so all we said was, why don't we take a sensible approach, which they've taken for non-levy, look at the last 3 months' activity and see if you can preserve that level right across the board.
Sure. Do you think...
And not the complication of non-levy, it should have been right across the board.
Yeah.
And it's not a bailout for doing nothing, it's a bailout for doing all of the activity that, frankly, training providers will end up doing anyway.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a really important point you make about bailouts, in the sense that that's a slightly loaded term, isn't it? So it suggests somehow, like in 2008 with the banks, the taxpayers were in for quite a big bill. And, the point you've made, I think, really well, which is, look, this is budgets that are set anyway on an annual government fiscal year basis. It's money that's set within the Department for Education's overall budget. A lot of it is passed on to the Education Skills Funding Agency, that we shouldn't forget, does spend around about £1 in 10 of public money, or certainly did until we started borrowing billions to deal with COVID-19. So, this is activity that would have taken place anyway. Do you think the government missed a trick? And by that I mean the government in England, because in Wales, when all this sort of broke, they were very clear that your money was in the budget, so the activity, even if it was ahead of delivery, should continue. Do you think England should just follow the Welsh example?
I think it's slightly different, but they should have followed the Welsh principles, which is they had allocated that budget. In fact, in England, it's allocated through the levy. So for apprenticeships, they've collected it from employers for a specific reason. So not spending it, which they won't this year now. So they collected 2.1 billion in England, and each of the countries are different, but they collected that money, and they're not going to spend it on that. So they're going to spend it on something else. Yeah. And then fund the training providers through the furlough scheme. Now, the cynics amongst us might say, well, hang on a minute, the apprenticeship money is the DFE money, and so they're happy to save that, whilst the Treasury puts in the total fund around furloughing staff, and the DFE look heroes because they've saved some of their money.
Yeah. Do you think, Stewart, we've got a sort of left arm, right arm problem here in government? So, crisis struck. Obviously, the priority for government when it's putting in all these social distancing measures was to say, right, we're in effect forcing parts of the economy to go into hibernation. We need to compensate employers, businesses, employees, and indeed, belatedly, the self-employed around that. So there's a message from one part of government, which is, look, if you're affected by COVID-19, the best thing potentially you should do is just go into hibernation, stay home, and collect your furloughed wages. So that's clear. Employers have got that signal, but equally, what has been happening, and I see this, in my day job and working with colleagues across the post-16 skills sector, there is a very strong desire, justifiably so, to keep the show on the road. So to keep those endpoint assessments going in relation to apprenticeships, or to keep that training provision going, even if, for example, the employer's still furloughing those apprentices. So you've got that Treasury sort of led part of government. You've got the Department for Education in the middle, and then you've got the Cabinet Office, which is responsible for sort of public procurement. And again, this is an area that starts to give me a headache when I start to read into some of the detail. But they've announced, for example, this whole supplier relief program. If you're a public contracting authority, I believe it relates something to do with 2015 regulations. I'm not going to go any further than that on a live radio show because I don't really understand every single aspect of it. But how how is the Cabinet Office implicated, if you like, in all this, and why has it really become such a bone of contention, between particularly the independent training provider sector and government about arguably a sort of different interpretations, you might say, of that guidance?
Yeah, well, there's clearly a complete worry, fear about double funding. In other words, that if they preserve the funding to support apprentices, somehow training providers will make all their staff, or put all their staff on furlough, and so they'll be paying twice. And we all know, and that's why it's always difficult for training providers to throw around, these throwaway lines that, everybody's out to. That would have worked, and I don't think they ever really sat down and thought it through, and I don't think they really understood the sort of activities that are required to preserve and support the current apprenticeship base and the current employers. They sort of thought you could shut it down.
Right.
The first thing they did was to make it easy for employers to put people on a break. And they don't realise that putting on people on a break, you can't just restart it in 3 months. Everything's back to normal. Let's restart. No, those people will have been made redundant, or they've got changed jobs, or they're got different hours. They just didn't understand the operational activity, and frankly, they didn't trust the provider base enough. And of course, this is not ITPs, independent providers versus colleges. The same applies to colleges for apprenticeships. And it was crazy. So I don't think they understood it well enough, and I don't think they wanted to stick their necks out enough with the Treasury to say, look, the furlough scheme is fine, but it's not really appropriate for us. We did a slightly different scheme. And guess what? It's taken them 5 weeks. They finally got round to non-levy, and I think the same principles will apply to levy. There is a contract with the with training providers. You can create a volume which you could, and they should have applied that to the levy as well. And then the sector could have got on with it. So, we're now going to have another week or two going backwards and forwards about can you treat non-levy differently to levy. Crazy.
So final thought, Stewart, because we need to press on and get on with the show. But just a final thought from you. I mean, how do we get things back on track in your view? You kind of alluded to some of that there about what should be happening in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, well, I mean, it is at least a good step that they've at least conceded that there's a contract between training providers and the government where we can use that resources, use that investment to keep the apprenticeship program on track, and similarly with AEB. Hopefully that will be a start, and hopefully we'll see the benefit of that, and you never know, they may accept that same principle for the levy program.
Let's hope they do. Stuart Segal, always a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks so much.
Cheers, Tom.
Being on Skills World. See you soon.
Bye now.
Bye. Time to get a bit funky. It's Friday after all. It's a track called Cinnamon by Lionel Quick. Okay, that was a funky track there by Lionel Quick, and it's called Cinnamon. On the line to continue tonight's big debate, I'm delighted to be joined by Terry Fennell, who's the Chief Executive and Responsible Officer of FDQ Limited, and Matt Garvey, Managing Director at the West Berkshire Training Consortium. Good evening, chaps.
Good evening.
Hi, Tom.
Hi. Thanks so much for joining Skills World this evening. It is your Friday evening, after all. Thanks for giving it up.
Not much else to do, Tom.
No, there's not. Matt Garvey, you've been quite critical on social media. I've been following you a lot, actually, during this crisis in relation to support for training providers. And I was just talking to Stewart Segal there about the myriad, it seems, of different schemes that are available. I mean, has today's announcements on the supply relief programme, has that done anything for you to address those concerns?
Well, it's something which is an improvement on nothing. I think what still troubles me is that it's still an inequitable approach to apprenticeships, in which if you're a college, your funding is pretty much secured. You can proceed with a sense of sustainability and surety. And if you're an independent provider, you're not in that same position. This new announcement, which I'll be spending my weekend picking through. First and foremost, I don't understand why it's just a 4 working day deadline to get the analysis in.
4 working days. Who's
sorry?
Yeah, 4 working days. Who's giving you that ridiculous deadline?
Well, yeah, the ESFA have. So
right, okay.
We'll have to work over the weekend to get the data together.
A lot of that. Yeah.
And still this strange differentiation between providers who do have a non-levy contract and those who are kind of wholly reliant upon levy-funded apprenticeships, which sort of begs the question, are all apprentices equal? Or are some more equal than others? Sure,
yeah. Well, let's explore that in a bit more detail shortly. I just want to bring Terry in now. Terry, you run a niche endpoint assessment organisation in a sector where occupations like butchers and fishmongers need to be practically observed, really, to show their competence. I mean, how on earth can endpoint assessments, in your view, keep going in that sort of current lockdown situation?
Yeah, it's true, and we actually rely upon many of sort of customers and clients like Matt's company, independent training providers and colleges who have got work-based learning departments as well. We're very much dependent upon them being able to continue to train and to receive funding so that they can submit their apprentices into our gateway so that we can ultimately deliver. So in the food and drink industry, it's on the front line. It's been really, really difficult for both the training providers, and so they'd be with a double whammy in the food sector, in that, one, they can't get access to the apprentices, and two, even if they could, then they weren't getting funded for it. So we really have hit a bit of a lockdown in our sector. So last 6-8 weeks have basically yielded no endpoint assessments, and I would be having 20, 30, 40 a month at this stage. So it's been a really, really sort of worrying period for us. Now, just in the last week or so, though, I've got to give credit. The Institute for Apprenticeships have been trying to introduce some flexibilities into the so that the normal methods of assessment, often in, as you said there, butchers and bakers and fishmongers and sometimes food operatives, it's really required us to carry out a face-to-face type of direct observation.
Yeah.
Clearly, that's not been possible. But in the last week or two, we have been sort of in talks with the IFA to look at flexible approaches. And today, actually, we've got some news today of some flexibilities have now been approved. So it opens the door slightly, a bit like Matt earlier. We've got some slight sort of light at the end of the tunnel, and we'll be spending the next week looking at how we can actually exploit that with our employers.
Yeah. Do you think one real challenge for the skills sector, perhaps unlike the airlines and some of the other sectors like restaurants and bars, which in effect have been ordered, haven't they, just to shut down, there's always been this ambiguity around the skills sector, because obviously when learners are involved, and the Secretary of State's been at the forefront of this, Gavin Williamson, by talking about the need not to disadvantage those that will need qualifications or examination grades this summer. So, the modus operandi, it seems to me, has been very much how do you keep the show on the road, even with all the strict social distancing measures and the lockdown that's in force. I mean, Matt, one of the things that I was just discussing with Stewart Segal before the break was whether in hindsight, the government should have just taken this more principled position, which is close to what they did in the Welsh Assembly, which was, look, this is money in the budget anyway for the provision. Why don't we just get on and carry on supporting all the provision? And then you wouldn't get into this, from what I hear you're hinting at, of a kind of some apprentices are more equal than others. Some types of training providers appear to be more equal than others. The colleges, for example, had their grant funding secured very early on. That's not happened, has it, with the ITPs?
It hasn't, and hasn't happened with private childcare settings either.
Right.
And, you have to drill this down to the Department for Education, because, the private sector provides a huge amount of public services. Think about private social care, for example. And in other departments, that differentiation between public and private has not been made. The Department of Transport is going to bail out private bus companies who are losing money, keeping routes going. So I think, when you cut through this is a DfE cultural problem,
right,
where they have delineated between providers who feel really should be guaranteed and assured a future, and those not. But of course, at the end of that decision are individual apprentices and their employers.
On that point, because really, you're sort of suggesting there, and I saw it a little bit actually in Mark Dawes' comments to FE News earlier today, about a sense that, whether this is still the case or not, but certainly a bit of an allegation there that there's a bit of Darwinian economics taking place at the Department of Education, that there might be a sort of sense of don't waste a good crisis. If this is an opportunity to see some providers go to the wall and it's there's a shakeout of provision, it could be a good thing. Is that what you're sort of suggesting potentially is what the DfE culture is around that?
Well, I was mulling over this and how all the decisions have been made and why. Came to a theory. If I wanted to put independent training providers out of business, this is exactly how I'd go about it. I would refuse to help. I would then prevaricate over helping. I would then say, well, help some and not others. And in the meantime, of course, for smaller providers, in particular, time is not on our side. Some will just run out of time. So I don't know whether it's by design or by accident, but this strategy hurts independent providers on a massive scale. And as I say, without navel gazing, that hurts apprentices because it's they and their employers will have to pick up the pieces when, a bunch of providers suddenly cease trading. So it's just inexplicable. I can't think of any logical reason why they've taken this approach.
Terry, if there's one thing that government should do, or the Institute or any of its agencies, that they should just be doing right now to really support this whole apprenticeship journey, because it starts with the providers, and the system certainly as it's evolved around the standards is that all apprentices, or most of them anyway, are required to go through this gateway and endpoint assessment process. That's fine for some of the occupations where there are professional observations and online and Skype and other types of remote sort of assessment can be done. What's the answer though for those sectors like yours that are are based on the skilled trades? They're about practical occupational competence.
Yeah, when the COVID first started to kick in, I was sort of hoping that there would be some sort of relief package really early on, because it's not as if the training providers and also the endpoint assessment organisations, we have learners on programs, we have profiles, and we have sort of expectations of learners. And I know that they can't pay retrospectively, that's the old rule. But hang on,
but that's not what the Cabinet Office guidance says, though, is it? That actually makes a virtue of saying that public contracting authorities should look to pay ahead of delivery, ahead of activity, where possible.
Yeah, it just sounds to me, and Matt sort of intimated there, it seems like they've got so much distrust of the delivery market. And, let's face it, those learners are profiled. They've got all of that information at the ESFA. They know what providers' sort of funding patterns are. And really, in the last few weeks, it's placed providers in a really difficult position in terms of furlough, because they always revert back. Well, they can furlough. Well, hang on. When there's learners in place and there's employers and you've got all your relationships, you can't just put people on furlough and then just close down.
Absolutely.
You have to keep services running. And we found that in the endpoint assessment. It was really a question of stick or twist, and you're almost by furloughing staff, it felt really, really bad. It was, from a chief executive's position, a really difficult position, because you were sort of in a no-win situation. And I think really they should have put more trust in the provider sector and offered some grant funding. Because as I say, the college learners are there. They know that they're there because they're paying a sort of a per head sort of basis. Well, it's the same for apprenticeships. We're getting paid per head. Okay. If then at 3 months later that those learners have left, or we haven't offered any sort of activity in that meantime, then there's a way of recovering that money that you might have earned wrongly. But they should have kept the money flowing into the system, and they didn't really offer any sort of real packages like that for the independents until today. And even today, when I've sort of had a quick look through, it looks like it's a sort of there are strings attached, which, Matt just said he's going to have to work through over the weekend. I'm relying upon providers like Matt and many others out there, and certainly our own. We've got a lot of smaller independent providers who work in very niche areas like the butchery specialists or the bakery specialists, etc. And we're relying upon them coming through this difficult period.
Absolutely.
So that we can, they're our lifeblood.
Yeah.
And if things happen to them, it will only be negative impact on us.
Yeah. Matt, in terms of where we go from here, what's your ambition? Well, what would you like to see that culture at the Department for Education right now respond to?
I think, first of all, recognising that it doesn't matter the type of institution. We're providing apprenticeships first and foremost, and they are real individual people, their employers and their families, and they should be assured equally. The second thing, and I think, and Terry and anyone who leads an organisation will know, when you're at the top, you've always got an eye on the future. So you deal with the here and now. Yeah. The next crisis is youth unemployment.
Yes.
Now, in the last recession, I think youth unemployment ran at about 5 times the normal
general
unemployment rate.
Yeah.
And that we had the luxury of seeing it coming.
Yeah.
It built up over months. This is going to hit us like a tidal wave. And who's going to pick up the pieces? Colleges will play their part, but it will come down to independent providers in the main to provide.
Well, they provide
something.
75% or thereabouts of apprenticeships. But I think the point, actually, that both of you have made very eloquently is, well, you didn't mention this word, but the way I look at it is, the whole post-16 skill system is an ecosystem. It's interdependent on each other, because ultimately that's how you service tens of thousands of learners, of apprentices, of people that are looking to retrain and reskill each and every year. Look, this debate's going to rumble on. Thanks, chaps, very much for giving up your Friday evenings to talk to me on a live community radio station.
Thanks, Tom. Pleasure.
Yeah,
Thank you.
great to speak to you. Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
So that was Terry Fennell there and Matt Garvey. Great chaps. I think they had a lot of really sane and positive things to say there. Now this track, a bit of calm before the storm. I promised you, didn't I, that my DJ Van Allen set will, not for the faint-hearted, but that will come later at the end of the show. So go and top up that drink and stay tuned for our next guest. It's a college principal from South London who has joined up with other FE colleges around the country and done something rather amazing. She's supporting vulnerable people during this pandemic. We'll find out more about that after ENZO from Jones Meadow. ENZO. That's from Jones Meadow. Rather tame track. Right, we're into the closing parts of the show now, and I think in every Skills World Live, towards the end of each hour, I'm really keen actually that we spotlight some of the unsung heroes, frankly, that are out there during this very challenging time, and they're doing their best as sector leaders to try and bring people together, communities together. You know, they're there actually trying to support some of our most vulnerable people in our community. And I'm delighted that Dr. Sam Parrett, who's the Group Principal and CEO at London and South East Education Group, is joining at the line. Sam, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, Tom. Hello, good evening.
Yeah, good evening to you. I think the last time we met Sam in person, completely coincidentally, it was on a flight back from Dubai. I think it was when I last saw you. A
very delayed flight.
Yeah, delayed, as in 24 hours delayed, I
Indeed.
seem to remember. Yeah, anyway, yeah. I had my teenage son with me, and you can imagine he wasn't... he's not the most patient man in the world, but we got back eventually. And do you know what? When I think about in the end, do you know when I think about those travel experiences, particularly during this lockdown? I think, God, they were the days, weren't they, when you could just travel anywhere without any restrictions. You must think the same. Anyway,
we're in a different place.
We are in a different place. Yeah. We are now. Look, you know about tonight's big debate and the theme on whether the sector should receive additional financial support during the pandemic. I mean, have you got any reflections on support for the sector? I mean, you run a huge college group in South London, so you know the whole challenge around your students and funding learners and furloughing staff or not furloughing staff. I mean, these must be the kind of issues that are in your in-tray on a regular basis.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my college group, we've got a group of 3 colleges that merge. We've also got a multi-academy trust with 7 schools in it and an independent training provider. So obviously that crosses, all of the different aspects of our work. And I can only say from our sort of personal experience, really, that everything that we've experienced in the last few weeks demonstrates that there is a good understanding of the difficult financial positions that we're in. There is a lot of support, I think, and commitment to ensuring that all aspects of the skills system are stabilised and that we all survive the financial threats, because it's in nobody's interest, actually, for any part of the skills system to fall apart during this time. So although I know it's frustrating that certain elements are taking longer to come forward, as your discussion earlier this evening has said, it is a bumpy path, but it does feel like we're getting there. And I think for many of us, if we're going to get, about 80% to where we might have ended up at the end of the year, that will probably be a good outcome for most of us. And as the latter part of your last interview was just saying, I think many of us are now already really turning to what the next financial year looks like and what the concerns are there, because the impact on enrolment, on whether employers will take up apprenticeships, what will happen around the HE-FE cusp, and will they introduce a learner number cap in higher education that would not then have a detrimental impact on further education around the level 3-4 cusp. There's lots and lots of issues, I think.
Yeah, well, that's
we're worried about in the longer term as much as the short term.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, isn't it? I mean, there's the dealing with the here and now, the immediate crisis, but of course, you're strategic leaders, you're running institutions where you're thinking 6, 12, 5, 10 years ahead in some cases. When you think about this September, do you think things will be back to normal by then, or is, as one sector leader said to me the other day, we're talking about now the new normal in further education?
I think we just really don't know at this point in time. I think there are still many, many risks on the assumption that we are open and students are enrolling. We're expecting that we'll still be having to adopt social distancing policies. And so in my college, we're already looking at what that might mean for us, from everything from traditional enrolment processes, and I'm sure you'll have seen lots of colleges are moving online with those sorts of activities, to actually remodelling our curriculum. And we're looking at this in our schools and in our colleges to try and see whether how you actually do almost double up your activity in order to only have half the volume of young people in a school or college at any point in time.
Yeah.
So whether you do a different type of attendance. But one of the real positives, I think, that's come out of this last few weeks is how well we've all adapted to online learning. And I was in a call with some of my colleagues earlier in the week, and we're all seeing really high levels of engagement with online learning, typically not too far off what we would have expected in terms of normal college attendance.
Right.
And so that tells us that level of engagement in what is good quality online learning that has young people coming back for more is something that we can sustain longer term, and that will allow us hopefully to build more innovative learning programs and keep young people engaged. But I think probably if there's a single biggest worry that we all have, it is around that rising youth unemployment that was talked about earlier, and what inevitably will be the growth in NEETs. And I think what we've certainly seen in the college is that the hardest groups to engage in this current crisis are those lower level learners, particularly our level 1 learners, typically our NEETs. And they are the groups that are engaging least well, and I know the Department for Education is worried about that and putting lots of thought into how they might deal with that, but they're going to be the most difficult group to re-engage in September as well.
Yeah, well, let's talk now about some of these really vulnerable groups in our society. And look, I mean, you set up this Food Bank Friday initiative. Tell us a bit about that.
Sure. So we, as a college, like many colleges, we're very much focused on, the contribution that we're determined to make in terms of not just the educational aspects, but also contributing to the economic and social well-being of the communities that we operate within. And so we, like many colleges, have been offering a food bank and all sorts of other ways of donating into our local communities, whether it's through the food that comes out of our training restaurants or through staff donating. And about a year ago, we re-established ourselves as a social enterprise organisation, really very much focused on being firmly embedded in our local community. And so we, like many colleges, had physical food banks in our college campuses. And it was really when we realised, as lockdown was announced, that we weren't going to be able to make those quite significant weekly contributions to our local food banks that we came up with the idea of taking it online. Yeah. And we just thought that if every Friday, every college in the country, every member of staff that was able to thought about whether they could contribute. Initially, we sort of jokingly said, instead of buying an Easter egg, contribute the cost of your Easter egg because you can't buy one in the shop through the food bank campaign. Yeah. But then we said, well, think about what you're saving in not buying coffees in the coffee shops at college and things each week. So we decided to set up the FE Food Bank Friday within our own college. And very quickly, within a week or so, we'd raised £3,000 or £4,000. And so we decided to invite other colleges to join, and we set
It's been amazing, hasn't it? I mean, I've been looking at it all on. Yeah, I mean, I've just been following the social media output on it and all the different colleges around the country that you've got involved. So, I mean, it's truly a national initiative. This programme, Skills World Live, will be making a donation to your initiative. But how can other people get involved in donating and being involved in Food Bank Friday with you? Briefly.
Yeah, so we've now got 30 colleges, and as of this afternoon, we've got a college in Scotland as well that's joined us. So we've spread the complete breadth of the and depth of the country now.
Fantastic.
We've got a completely corporate, if you like, approach to it, which is that we're using the Just Giving site, and if you go there and you just simply search FE Food Bank Friday, all of the colleges will come up.
Great.
And so people can make a donation to an individual college, and next week we'll have a corporate site up and running where people can make a national contribution. So we've already got some big sponsors who are going to be coming online next week, making some national donations, which will then be distributed around all of the colleges. We very kindly had FE Week in the first week. They gave £500.
Yeah, very generous of our friends there. Fantastic.
Absolutely, that was brilliant from Shane and Nick in the first week. So what we're trying to do is really just connect what we're doing in a remote way while the colleges are not physically able to collect food. And everybody will be then linking to their local food bank.
Yeah, well, Sam, listen, I promise you, we're going to make sure we put the link on the Skills World Live website so people can donate. Sam Parrett, we're running out of time, unfortunately, on the show, but it's always a pleasure to catch up with you. Thank you so much for coming on and being a guest on my community radio show. Take care. Bye.
Okay, bye.
That was Sam Parrett there, principal of the London and South East Education Group. Okay, let's notch things up a little bit, shall we? Well, that's about all we've got time for on Skills World Live this evening. Where did the hour go? Oh, there's so much debate, so much dialogue. It's been lots of fun indeed. So join us next week for our weeknight shows, starting on Monday, when we're going to ask the question, when should the schools reopen? Thanks, everyone. Stay safe, stay well, and see you soon.